The sound wasn't loud when the truth landed. It was soft, almost polite. A whisper passed between my mother-in-law and her sister at the far end of the dining table, just loud enough to slip past the clink of cutlery and the forced laughter. "The passport appointment is confirmed. He said not to worry. She'll be gone before anyone asks questions." I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. No one noticed at first. Not my husband, who was busy refilling his wine glass. Not his cousins, arguing about vacation plans. Not even my mother-in-law, who smiled the way women do when they believe they're being careful. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not cracked, not shattered, just clicked into place. I didn't feel rage, I didn't feel heartbreak. What I felt was clarity. They weren't talking about a hypothetical. They weren't speculating. They were organizing, quietly, confidently, like people who believed they had every right to decide who stayed and who disappeared. When I finally asked, softly, evenly, what they meant, the table went still. My husband didn't look at me. My mother-in-law met my eyes for exactly 1 second before dismissing me with a small wave of her hand. "That's his private matter," she said. "You don't need to involve yourself." Private. The word sat there, heavy and absolute. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't ask again. And that's when they made their second mistake. Christmas dinners at my husband's family home always looked perfect from the outside. White tablecloths, gold-rimmed plates, candles arranged just so. The kind of gathering that made people assume warmth and tradition lived inside those walls. I had spent 6 years learning how wrong that assumption was. I was Natalie Parker, 35 years old, the wife who kept the peace, the woman who smoothed things over, remembered birthdays, handled logistics, and absorbed silence like it was part of the job description. In that family, I was useful, but never central. Present, but never consulted. That night I stayed quiet. I smiled when spoken to. I passed the bread. I went to the kitchen to help clear dishes while my husband laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, I was replaying that whisper over and over again. "The passport appointment. She'll be gone." When dessert was served, my husband leaned over and kissed my cheek, the same affectionate gesture he'd perfected for public settings. I wondered, not for the first time, how many things he believed I didn't notice. Later, after coats were gathered and goodbyes exchanged, my mother-in-law hugged me tightly. "Don't take everything so personally, Natalie," she said. "Families survive when we know when to stay out of things." I smiled and told her I understood. That night, in our bedroom, my husband fell asleep within minutes. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing even out. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I felt alert. Like someone who had just been handed a map they didn't know they'd been looking for. At 2 a.m, I got out of bed. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I opened my laptop at the desk by the window, the same one I used for bills and household planning. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, before I typed my own name into the search bar. Then his. Then the words no one ever thinks will matter until they do. Marriage agreement, asset clause, power of representation. I remembered signing so many documents years earlier, trusting the reassurance that it was all standard, routine, protective. I had been encouraged not to read too closely. "It's just paperwork," my husband had said. "My family's lawyer handles everything." That was my first mistake. What I found that night wasn't new. It had been there all along. A clause buried in supplemental pages, written in language so dry it almost begged to be ignored. It outlined conditions under which authority shifted automatically, without warning, without permission, if certain risks were introduced into the marriage. Foreign financial exposure, undisclosed third-party support, assistance in international relocation without spousal consent. My hands didn't shake as I read, my heart didn't race. I understood immediately why no one had mentioned it, why no one expected me to know. The passport wasn't just a favor, it wasn't kindness, it wasn't family protecting family. It was a trigger. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, I closed my laptop and sat back in the chair. The house was silent. My husband turned in his sleep, unaware that something fundamental had already shifted. I didn't make a call, I didn't send a message, I didn't confront anyone. I simply let the system do what it was designed to do. When I finally lay back down, I slept deeply, for the first time in months. By morning, my phone would show 37 missed calls. But in that moment, in the quiet before everything changed, I understood something with absolute certainty. They thought my silence meant I didn't matter. They were about to learn the difference between silence and surrender. By the time the coffee finished brewing the next morning, I already knew how the story would be told without me. I had lived inside that family long enough to recognize the pattern. Silence first, then justification, then a version of events that left no room for my voice. I married into the Parker family believing restraint was a virtue. My husband, Daniel, had admired it in the beginning. He liked telling people how calm I was, how I never overreacted, how I understood how families worked. What he really meant was that I didn't challenge the hierarchy. I didn't ask uncomfortable questions. I learned quickly when to step back and when to disappear into the background. Daniel's family functioned like a well-rehearsed committee. Decisions were made quietly, behind closed doors, and presented later as if they had always been inevitable. Holidays, finances, even marriages were treated as group matters. Individual feelings were tolerated only if they aligned with the collective plan. I wasn't born into that system. I married into it. At first, I thought the distance was cultural. His mother, Eleanor, liked to say she was simply protective of her own. His sisters laughed it off, telling me I'd get used to it. "They're close," they said. "You're lucky to be included at all." Included, it turned out, was conditional. The first time I sensed something was wrong wasn't dramatic. It never is. It was a missed call. Daniel didn't return while sitting beside me on the couch. A text he read and immediately deleted. A sudden interest in travel logistics that had nothing to do with us. When I asked, he brushed it off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Work stuff," he said. "You know how it is?" I did know how it was. I knew how people lie when they don't think you'll push. Months passed. Then a year. I heard a name once accidentally from one of his cousins. I didn't recognize it, and when I asked, she changed the subject so fast it was almost impressive. Daniel became defensive in small ways. Locked phone, short temper, long evenings out explained with vague excuses. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of that was love. Part of it was pride. And part of it was conditioning. In that family, women who asked too much were labeled difficult. Women who stayed agreeable were praised for their maturity. I had built my place carefully, brick by brick, convincing myself that patience was strength. It wasn't until the money started shifting that my unease turned into something sharper. Joint accounts became less predictable. Transfers appeared without explanation. Daniel insisted it was temporary, that his parents needed help restructuring something. "Family business," he said, like it was a password that should end the conversation. I noticed how often Eleanor spoke in absolutes. "We'll handle it." "This is already taken care of." "It's better this way." Her confidence wasn't reassurance, it was a warning. She didn't explain because she didn't believe she had to. Looking back, I realized the affair wasn't the betrayal that broke the illusion. It was the coordination. The way his family closed ranks around him without hesitation. The way they discussed logistics, paperwork, and outcomes with the same tone they used to plan birthdays. The passport conversation at Christmas wasn't the beginning. It was confirmation. After breakfast that morning, Daniel left early. He kissed my forehead and told me not to wait up. His phone buzzed as he walked out the door. I watched him read the message in the hallway mirror, his expression tightening for just a second before smoothing back into calm. I didn't follow him. I didn't ask where he was going. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and replayed every moment I'd dismissed over the past 2 years. The sudden trips, the unexplained expenses, the way his mother had once asked me, casually, whether I'd ever considered living abroad. I had laughed at the time, thinking it was idle conversation. It wasn't. By noon, the calls started. Not to me. Around me. Daniel's phone rang twice while he was gone, lighting up the screen with his sister's name. Eleanor texted, asking if he was with me. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt. I spent the afternoon doing what I'd always done when things felt unstable. I organized, I reviewed documents, I traced patterns. I wasn't looking for proof of infidelity anymore. That part was clear. I was looking for structure. Because affairs end, systems don't. By evening, I understood my position more clearly than I ever had before. I wasn't being betrayed by one man. I was being managed by a family. And the role they'd assigned me was already decided. I was the wife who would be informed after the fact. The woman who would be told what was necessary and nothing more. The obstacle they believed they could move quietly out of the way. They underestimated how much I'd learned by staying quiet. When Daniel came home that night, he avoided my eyes. He talked about traffic, about work, about anything except what mattered. I listened, I nodded, I even laughed at the right moments. Later, as he slept, I sat beside him and looked at the man I had built my life around. I didn't hate him. I didn't feel rage. What I felt was distance. The kind that forms when you finally see the whole picture and realize you were never meant to be part of it. They thought I didn't belong at the table. They never asked what I'd learned while standing just outside the room. The first thing I did was stop asking questions out loud. I had learned the cost of curiosity in that house. Questions invited explanations, and explanations were always designed to end the conversation, not clarify it. So instead of asking, I observed. Instead of confronting, I collected. I started with what I could see. Bank statements, travel confirmations, insurance renewals, the mundane paper trail most people skimmed and forgot. Daniel had always left those things to me. He liked saying I was better with details, which I now understood meant he assumed I wouldn't look too closely at the wrong ones. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped pretending they were accidents. There were regular transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, always just under the amount that would trigger a notification. Payments labeled as reimbursements that didn't match any expense we'd had. Travel bookings made in clusters, as if someone were planning several contingencies at once. And threaded through all of it was his family's involvement. His mother's email address copied, his sister's name on confirmations, his father's signature appearing where it had no reason to be. This wasn't an affair being hidden, it was an operation being managed. At night, while Daniel slept beside me, I read through old files I hadn't opened in years. Documents from the early days of our marriage, scanned and saved under names that meant nothing now. Back then, I had been told it was all precaution, protection, standard procedure for a family with assets. I remembered sitting in a law office, smiling politely as papers slid across the table. I remembered Daniel squeezing my hand and whispering that it was boring stuff, nothing I needed to worry about. I remembered trusting that boredom meant safety. It didn't. There were entire sections I had never fully read, not because I couldn't, but because I had been encouraged not to. Appendices, supplemental clauses, conditions triggered by actions that would never happen. Except they were happening. The more I read, the clearer it became that his family's confidence didn't come from ignorance. It came from habit. They had done this before, not necessarily with passports, not necessarily with mistresses, but with outcomes. They were used to moving people around the board and calling it necessity. I thought back to a conversation years earlier, one I'd dismissed at the time. Eleanor had been talking about a distant cousin whose marriage had ended suddenly. It was unfortunate, she'd said, her tone smooth, but it was handled cleanly. Everyone moved on. Handled cleanly. I wondered then how many women had heard that phrase after their lives were quietly rearranged. By midweek, I had mapped more than I'd expected. I didn't need proof of emotional betrayal anymore. I had something far more dangerous. Evidence of coordination, dates, names, overlaps that only made sense if multiple people were acting together. Still, I told no one. Daniel noticed the change before he understood it. He asked if I was tired, if work was stressful, if I needed a weekend away. I said no to all of it. I watched him closely as he spoke, noting how his concern was more about my mood than my questions. That told me everything. On Thursday evening, his sister called while we were eating dinner. He didn't answer, but the screen lit up with her name, followed by a second call, then a text. He turned the phone face down, his jaw tightening just slightly. "You should take it," I said lightly. "It might be important." He studied me for a moment as if recalibrating. "It can wait." It couldn't, and we both knew it. Later that night, I heard him in the living room speaking in low tones. I didn't try to listen. I didn't need to. I already knew the topic. The timeline was slipping, the margins were closing, and they were beginning to sense resistance where they'd expected compliance. What surprised me wasn't their urgency. It was their assumption. They assumed I would react emotionally, that I would accuse, cry, demand explanations. They assumed I would make noise, and noise could be managed, smoothed over, discredited. They didn't consider the possibility that I would do nothing at all. On Friday, I made copies of everything, digital and physical. I didn't label them clearly. I didn't store them together. I treated the information the way I'd been treated for years, with discretion and distance. That afternoon, I took a walk alone, something I rarely did anymore. I let the cold air steady my thoughts. I asked myself one question, and only one. What do they think I don't know? The answer came easily. They thought I didn't understand the rules. They thought I had signed my name without reading the fine print, and that I would continue living inside the version of the marriage they found most convenient. They thought the passport was a detail. By the time I returned home, I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I felt resolved. I understood now that this wasn't about choosing sides. It was about choosing reality. And reality was written down, quietly, in documents they had trusted me to ignore. That night, as Daniel slept, I opened my laptop again. I didn't search randomly this time. I went straight to the section that mattered, the one everyone had counted on me forgetting. I read it slowly, line by line, until the implications settled fully in my chest. I hadn't been powerless. I had been patient. And patience, when paired with understanding, has a way of becoming something else entirely. By Saturday morning, I stopped pretending this was something that could be fixed with a conversation. The house felt different when Daniel left early again, his jacket pulled on in a hurry, his goodbye too casual. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car disappear down the street, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to follow him with questions. I felt the urge to verify. I began with the obvious, the shared calendar on our phones, the one he had insisted on syncing years ago so we could stay connected. Trips marked as work obligations that overlapped with dates on the travel confirmations I'd found. Meetings scheduled in cities he never used to visit. Gaps in the calendar where nothing was listed at all. The absences weren't random. They were protected. Then I moved to the less obvious places. The cloud storage Daniel assumed I never touched. The family email threads that included me only when logistics were harmless. There were messages forwarded and partially deleted, fragments that only made sense when placed beside each other. His mother's careful phrasing, his sister's reminders. The subtle pressure to move quickly before things complicated. Things, always things, never people. By noon, my phone buzzed with a message I hadn't expected. It was from Laura, the family's longtime accountant. She'd handled everything from holiday budgets to larger restructuring projects, and she'd always been polite to me in the way professionals are polite when they don't want to take sides. The message was brief. "Just checking in. Let me know if you need copies of anything." I stared at it longer than necessary. Laura wasn't reaching out casually. She was offering a lifeline without naming it. That told me more than any confession could have. I replied with a simple thank you and asked for copies of recent filings, phrasing it as routine. Her response came back almost immediately. "Of course." An hour later, my inbox filled with attachments. What I saw confirmed what I'd already suspected. Financial movements timed to travel planning, authorizations signed under the assumption of joint consent, supporting documents prepared in advance, waiting only for the final step to make everything official. They weren't just helping someone leave, they were insulating themselves from questions. I felt a familiar sensation then, the one I'd spent years suppressing. Not anger, not grief, recognition. This was what they did when they wanted something done quietly. That afternoon, Eleanor called. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was warm, almost indulgent. She asked how I was feeling, whether I was resting enough. She spoke as if the dinner conversation had never happened, as if nothing had shifted. "We don't want unnecessary tension," she said gently. "These things have a way of sorting themselves out if we don't interfere." Interfere? The word was chosen carefully. I told her I agreed. I told her I trusted the family to handle what needed handling. I told her I was tired and would talk another time. She sounded relieved, and when we hung up, I understood why. They believed the window was still open. That night, Daniel came home late. He seemed distracted, restless in a way I'd never seen before. He paced while talking about work, about stress, about how everyone expected too much from him. He didn't ask me anything. He didn't need to. He assumed the narrative was still intact. When he finally fell asleep, I didn't reach for my laptop right away. I sat there in the quiet, listening to the hum of the house, thinking about all the moments I'd been told to stay out of things, all the times I'd been praised for my discretion. Discretion, I realized, wasn't loyalty, it was access. I opened the folder I'd marked days earlier, the one containing the agreement everyone had treated like an afterthought. I read it again, slower this time, following each reference to its source, cross-checking definitions, matching dates. The clause wasn't dramatic, it didn't threaten or accuse. It simply outlined a shift in authority under specific conditions that were now being met, step by careful step. The more I read, the more certain I became of one thing. I didn't need to accuse anyone, I didn't need to prove intent. The structure did that for me. At 2:30 in the morning, I drafted a single email. It wasn't to Daniel, it wasn't to his family, it was to the firm listed in the agreement, the one that handled oversight when predefined risks appeared. I used neutral language, I attached documents, I asked for confirmation, not permission. I sent it and closed my laptop. The reply came before dawn. "Receipt acknowledged, review initiated." That was all. I lay back down beside my husband, my heart steady, my thoughts clear. I knew there would be consequences. I knew there would be noise. But I also knew that for the first time since I'd married into that family, I wasn't reacting to their decisions. I was letting their decisions speak for themselves. By the time morning came, the mechanism they'd trusted me to ignore was already moving. And whether they realized it yet or not, the outcome was no longer something they could manage behind closed doors. The first sign that something had shifted wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. An automated notification appeared on my phone just after 9 in the morning, tucked between a calendar reminder and a grocery delivery update. The subject line was neutral, almost polite, "Review status update." I read it twice before the meaning settled. Certain permissions were under temporary review. Certain authorizations were paused pending verification. Nothing accusatory, nothing emotional. Just a quiet acknowledgement that a line had been crossed and the system had noticed. I didn't forward it to Daniel. I didn't mention it when he called during his lunch break, his voice oddly cheerful, as if he were trying too hard to keep the day ordinary. I listened, responded in the right places, and waited. By mid-afternoon, the calls began. The first was from his sister. I let it go to voicemail. The second was from Eleanor. I answered that one. Her tone was different this time. Still calm, but sharpened at the edges. She asked if I'd noticed any unusual account activity, if I'd received any messages that might be confusing. She spoke slowly, as if clarity were something she could control with cadence. I told her I hadn't noticed anything concerning. There was a pause, not long but long enough. "Well," she said, "if anything does come up, let us know. It's probably just a routine check." Routine, the word was doing a lot of work. After we hung up, I opened my email again. Another message had arrived, this one confirming receipt of additional documentation. The language was careful, precise, review expanding, related accounts included. I understood then that this wasn't a single door closing, it was a hallway of them. Daniel came home early that evening. He didn't mention work. He didn't mention the family. He stood in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, his jaw tight. When he finally looked at me, there was a question in his eyes he didn't ask. "Have you heard from anyone today?" he said instead. I shrugged. A few people, nothing urgent. He nodded too quickly. "Good." Dinner passed in an uneasy quiet. He barely touched his food. His phone buzzed constantly, lighting up the table like a heartbeat. He silenced it once, then again, then finally picked it up and walked into the other room. I heard his voice rise, then fall, words I couldn't quite make out, frustration bleeding into something closer to fear. When he returned, he looked at me differently, not with suspicion, with calculation. "This thing with the passport," he said casually, as if testing the ground. "It's getting more complicated than expected." I met his gaze. "How so?" He hesitated. "There are questions, delays." I nodded. "That happens." He studied me, searching for something. Reaction, guilt, reassurance. When he found none, he looked away. That night, as he slept fitfully, I lay awake and watched the glow of notifications flicker across his phone. Missed calls, messages piling up, a family group chat lighting up and going dark again, over and over. They were scrambling. The next morning, Eleanor arrived unannounced. She stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed, her expression composed but strained. She didn't sit down. She paced the living room, talking quickly now, her words overlapping. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said, "a clerical issue. We're sorting it out, but we need everyone aligned." Aligned, the word made me almost smile. She stopped pacing and looked at me directly. "You haven't spoken to anyone outside the family, have you?" I shook my head. "No." Her relief was immediate and telling. "Good. This is sensitive. We don't want unnecessary complications." I waited. She lowered her voice. "You need to understand that sometimes decisions are made to protect people, to prevent damage." "To whom?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was softer. "To the family." There it was. I told her I understood. I told her I trusted things would resolve themselves. She left not long after, her confidence partially restored. She believed the problem was still manageable, still internal. She was wrong. By noon, another notification arrived. This one confirmed a temporary freeze on specific transfers pending review. I watched the message appear, disappear, reappear, as if the system itself were breathing. My phone rang almost immediately after, Daniel this time. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "I don't know what you mean," I said truthfully. There was a long silence, then quieter. "This wasn't supposed to happen." I closed my eyes. "What wasn't?" "You're making things worse," he said. "We had a plan." I let the words settle. We had a plan. "I didn't agree to any plan," I said. "You didn't need to," he snapped. Then, catching himself, "Look, can we talk about this later, in person?" I agreed. I always agreed. That afternoon, the missed calls reached double digits. His sister, his mother, a number I didn't recognize. Voicemails stacked up, each one more urgent than the last. By evening, the tone had shifted entirely. No more reassurance, no more dismissal, only panic, thinly veiled behind demands for explanation, demands I didn't meet. As I watched the system continue its quiet work, one truth became undeniable. They had built their lives on the assumption that I would stay out of things, and now that I hadn't, everything they thought was secure was starting to come apart. Not because I attacked them, but because they had finally run into something they couldn't control. By the third day, the silence stopped feeling strategic and started feeling heavy. Not from them, from me. I woke up with my chest tight, the kind of pressure that comes from holding something in for too long. The notifications had slowed, but that didn't bring relief. It brought space. And in that space, questions began to echo. Had I gone too far? I moved through the morning on autopilot, answering emails, folding laundry, pretending that my life hadn't quietly tipped into something unrecognizable. Daniel had slept on the couch again, claiming he'd fallen asleep watching the news. I didn't correct him. We were both lying, just about different things. I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked calm, composed. But there was a flicker behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. Doubt, sharp and unwelcome. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and forced myself to ask the question I'd been avoiding. What if I was wrong? What if this spiraled beyond what I could contain? What if the fallout didn't just land on them, but on me? On my work, my reputation? the fragile sense of stability I'd spent years building. For the first time since Christmas, my resolve wavered. That was when memory slipped in, uninvited. I was back in Eleanor's living room years earlier, sitting on the edge of a sofa that was too expensive to be comfortable. Daniel stood near the fireplace, one hand on my shoulder, while his mother explained how these things worked. Family decisions, shared responsibilities, the importance of not embarrassing one another. I remembered nodding, smiling, telling myself that compromise was maturity, that love meant flexibility, that harmony was worth the occasional discomfort. I remembered the first time I stayed silent when something felt wrong, how relieved everyone looked, how proud Daniel had been of me afterward. "You handled that well," he'd said. "Not everyone knows when to let things go." Let things go. The flashback dissolved, leaving behind an ache I hadn't acknowledged before. That silence hadn't protected me. It had trained them. My phone buzzed, snapping me back to the present. A message from Daniel. "Can we reset? This is getting out of hand." Reset. As if this were a device malfunctioning, not a marriage unraveling under the weight of secrets. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the folder I'd created days earlier. Not to add anything new, but to reread what I already had. Dates, documents, confirmations, facts that didn't change just because my confidence wavered. Still, the doubt lingered. I took a walk that afternoon, letting the cold air sting my cheeks. I needed movement, something physical to ground me. As I walked, I passed couples arguing softly, parents corralling children, people living ordinary lives untouched by legal clauses and hidden plans. For a moment, I wanted that simplicity back so badly it hurt. Then my phone rang. It wasn't a family member. It wasn't Daniel. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was brief, but direct. The voice belonged to a woman, professional and controlled. "This is just a courtesy call," she said. "There are developments you should be aware of. I recommend you don't respond to any external pressure until we've completed our review." External pressure. The words landed with unexpected weight. This wasn't just in my head. This wasn't paranoia or overreaction. Something real was unfolding, and people outside the family were now involved. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tightness in my chest ease just a fraction. When I returned home, Daniel was waiting for me. He stood near the window, hands in his pockets, his posture tense. He looked like a man trying to decide which version of the truth to offer. "You're being unreasonable," he said before I could speak. "Everyone's upset. My mother hasn't slept. This could have been handled quietly." Quietly, there it was again. "I didn't make anyone do anything," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "You didn't stop it either," he shot back. "You knew what would happen." I met his gaze. "I knew what could happen. There's a difference." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched into every line of his face. "You're acting like this is some kind of moral stand." I considered that. "No," I said. "I'm acting like someone who finally read what she signed." The words hung between us, heavy and irrevocable. He looked away first. That night, doubt crept in again, softer this time, but persistent. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. I wondered what version of myself I would be when this was over. Stronger, maybe, or simply more alone. Just before sleep took me, another memory surfaced. It was me, years ago, standing in that same kitchen, defending Daniel to a friend who'd asked if I ever felt sidelined by his family. I'd laughed and said no. I'd said I didn't need to be at the center of everything to feel secure. I understood now how wrong I'd been. Security doesn't come from staying small. It comes from knowing where you stand. The next morning I woke with a quiet certainty replacing the doubt. Fear hadn't been a warning sign. It had been a test. And I had already passed the part where turning back was an option. Whatever came next, I would face it without apologizing for finally taking up space. By the time the third letter arrived, even they could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding. I found it folded neatly on the kitchen counter when I came home from the grocery store, placed there with deliberate care. Daniel must have seen it first. He must have read it, felt the weight of it, and decided to leave it where I couldn't miss it. The envelope was plain, official, its language unmistakable even before I opened it. Notice of temporary restriction. I didn't sit down right away. I stood there, keys still in my hand, reading the first paragraph twice. The wording was calm, procedural, almost gentle. But the implications were not. Access limited, authority suspended, review ongoing. This wasn't just pressure anymore, this was exposure. Daniel was in the living room pretending to watch television. The volume was too low, the screen flickering without purpose. When I walked in, he muted it instantly. "They sent another one," he said, as if I hadn't already seen it. I nodded. "I know." His jaw tightened. "My mother is beside herself." I waited. "She says this is humiliating," he continued. "People are asking questions, lawyers, banks, even extended family." There it was. Not concern, not accountability, embarrassment. "I never wanted this to become public," he said, softer now. "You know that." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't allowed myself to see before, not fear of consequences, fear of losing control over the narrative. "I didn't make it public," I said. "I made it accurate." He flinched just slightly. That evening, Eleanor called again. This time, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "You need to fix this," she said. No warmth, no reassurance, just command. "Whatever you did, undo it." "I didn't do anything," I replied calmly. "I stopped doing something." Silence crackled on the line. "You're being vindictive," she snapped. "This is about a personal matter. It has nothing to do with you." I almost laughed, almost. "It has everything to do with me," I said. "It always did. You just decided I didn't get a say." Her voice dropped, sharp and cold. "If you don't cooperate, there will be consequences." I closed my eyes, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. "There already are." I hung up before she could respond. That night, the family group chat erupted. Messages poured in faster than I could read them. Accusations thinly disguised as concern. Pleas framed as advice. Warnings wrapped in false affection. They wanted me to panic. They wanted me to rush in and smooth things over, to reassure them that I would clean up the mess they had made. I didn't reply. Instead, I watched. I watched as the tone shifted from confidence to confusion, from confusion to anger, from anger to desperation. Someone mentioned timelines. Someone else mentioned irreversible steps. Another suggested I was being manipulated by outsiders. Outsiders, as if truth itself were a foreign influence. The next morning I received confirmation of what I'd been waiting for. The review had expanded, additional documentation requested, secondary accounts flagged. I felt no triumph reading it, only clarity. Daniel tried one last time to reach me that afternoon, catching me as I was about to leave the house. "Please," he said, standing in the doorway. "Just talk to them. Say something. They're spiraling." I met his gaze, steady and unyielding. So was I, for years. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue, no angle he hadn't already tried. I walked past him, out into the daylight, feeling lighter with every step. Later that day, a new name appeared in my inbox. One I didn't recognize, but one that mattered. The subject line was brief. "Request for statement." I read the message carefully. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. An opportunity to speak on record, to clarify my position, to provide context. For a long moment I considered ignoring it, letting the process run without my voice. That would have been easier. But easier wasn't the same as right. I sat down at my desk and began to type. Not emotionally, not defensively, just honestly. I outlined timelines. I referenced documents. I described conversations without embellishment or bitterness. I let the facts speak in full sentences, uninterrupted for the first time. When I finished, I reread it once, then sent it. The reply came hours later. "Thank you, this is helpful." That was all. That night, as the house fell quiet again, I realized something fundamental had shifted, not just in them, but in me. I was no longer waiting for permission to exist within the story of my own life. They had tried to move pieces around me, assuming I would stay still, assuming I would remain invisible, agreeable, silent. Instead, I had become the point everything now revolved around. And they could feel it. The collapse wasn't loud yet. It hadn't reached its final stage. But the structure they'd built on secrecy and dismissal was already buckling. Not because I shouted, but because I finally spoke in the only language they respected. The truth on record. The backlash came faster than I expected, and it came from directions I hadn't prepared for. It wasn't Daniel or Eleanor this time. It was someone I barely knew, someone who had never raised their voice at me before. His uncle called mid-morning, his name lighting up my phone like a warning sign. I almost didn't answer. Almost. He didn't bother with greetings. "You're tearing the family apart," he said. "Do you understand that?" I listened without interrupting, letting him unload his frustration as if it were a script he'd rehearsed. He talked about loyalty, about tradition, about how families survive by closing ranks when threatened. He spoke as though I were an external force, not someone who had spent years at their tables in their homes, absorbing their rules. When he finally paused, I said quietly, "I didn't create this situation." "Yes, you did," he snapped, "by letting outsiders interfere." "Outsiders again." "I didn't invite anyone in," I replied. "I stopped keeping them out." He hung up without another word. I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the dark screen of my phone. That conversation confirmed something I'd suspected, but hadn't fully accepted. To them, the betrayal wasn't the affair. It wasn't the deception. It was my refusal to absorb the damage silently. By early afternoon, the pressure escalated. An email arrived from a firm I recognized immediately. Not the one overseeing the review, but another, one the family had used for years. The tone was polite, carefully neutral, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. They wanted a meeting. They wanted clarification. They wanted to resolve matters efficiently. Efficiently meant quietly. I forwarded the email to the address I'd been instructed to use days earlier. The reply came back less than an hour later. "Do not engage directly. We'll handle communication." Reading that felt like stepping out of a storm and into a reinforced building. For the first time since this began, I wasn't the only barrier between myself and their influence. Daniel noticed the change in me that evening. "You're calmer," he said cautiously, watching me from across the room. "That worries me." I smiled faintly. It should. He tried a different approach then, less anger, more regret. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "Things just got complicated." Complicated was his favorite word. It blurred responsibility, softened edges, made decisions sound accidental instead of deliberate. "You made choices," I said. "So did your family." "And now you're punishing all of us," he replied. I shook my head. "I'm letting consequences exist." He stared at me, searching for the woman he used to negotiate with, the one who'd compromised to keep the peace. When he didn't find her, his shoulders sagged. "You don't understand what you're risking," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "I understand exactly what I've been risking all along." That night, the messages slowed, replaced by something more unsettling. Silence. Not the strategic kind, not the calculating kind. This was the silence of people regrouping, of plans being rewritten behind closed doors. I could feel it, the way you feel pressure change before a storm. I slept lightly, waking at every sound, every shift in the house. When morning came, I checked my phone before I even sat up. 37 missed calls. Different numbers, different voicemails, the same urgency threaded through all of them. I didn't listen to a single one. Instead, I opened the newest message in my inbox. It was brief, formal, and far more significant than anything the family could say. "Review entering final phase." Final phase. The words settled into me slowly, bringing with them an unexpected sense of grief. Not for the marriage, that had been eroding for years, but for the illusion I'd clung to. The belief that if I stayed reasonable, if I stayed quiet, I could belong. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the neighborhood come to life. People leaving for work, kids waiting for buses, a normal morning unfolding while my world recalibrated itself. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Daniel. "They're talking about you. They're saying you've changed." I typed my response carefully. "I didn't change. I stopped disappearing." He didn't reply. By midday, confirmation arrived that several scheduled actions had been formally suspended. Travel plans, financial authorizations, legal proxies. Each line item felt like another brick removed from a structure that had never been as solid as they believed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. The final call of the day came just before sunset. The same professional voice as before, measured and steady. "We're nearing a conclusion," she said. "You should prepare for increased pushback." "I already have," I replied. There was a pause. "For what it's worth," she added, "you handled this with remarkable restraint." I ended the call and let the silence return, this time without fear. They were running out of leverage, out of time, out of ways to force me back into the role they'd assigned. Whatever they tried next would be louder, messier, more desperate. And for the first time, I knew without question that I was ready for it. The confrontation didn't happen the way I imagined it would. There was no raised voice at first, no slammed doors, just a request delivered through a carefully worded message from Eleanor, asking me to come by the house to clear the air. The phrase was almost laughable, as if air, once poisoned, could be cleared with politeness. I agreed to go. When I arrived, the living room was already arranged for an audience. Eleanor sat upright on the sofa, hands folded. Daniel's sister leaned against the fireplace, arms crossed. Two other relatives I barely spoke to stood near the windows, pretending to look outside. No one offered me a seat. Eleanor gestured vaguely. "We're concerned," she began. "This situation has escalated beyond what anyone intended." I nodded. "That happens when things are hidden." Her lips pressed together. "You're framing this unfairly. No one was trying to hurt you." "Intent doesn't erase impact," I replied. The room shifted. Subtle movements, exchanged glances. This wasn't how they expected the conversation to go. Daniel's sister stepped forward. "You've always been so sensitive," she said. "We assumed you understood how our family operates." "Operate, like a machine." "I understood I wasn't included," I said calmly. Eleanor inhaled sharply. "That's not true." "Then why wasn't I told?" I asked. "Why was I dismissed when I asked questions? Why was I told not to interfere?" Silence answered me. That silence was the confession. Eleanor straightened, her voice tightening. "This isn't about feelings anymore. There are real consequences, reputations, legal exposure. You need to cooperate." There it was, the pivot, from denial to demand. "I have cooperated," I said, "with the process." Daniel's sister scoffed. "You're hiding behind technicalities." "No," I replied, "I'm standing on them." Her face flushed, but she said nothing. Eleanor tried a different tactic. "If you withdraw your involvement now, we can minimize damage. We can move forward as a family." Move forward, together, as long as together meant silence. "I can't do that," I said. Daniel finally spoke then, his voice strained. "You're choosing this, over us." I turned to him. "I didn't choose deception. You did." His jaw clenched. "You're destroying everything." "No," I said softly. "I'm letting it fall where it already cracked." The tension in the room became palpable. One of the relatives shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat, then thought better of speaking. Eleanor's composure cracked at last. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she snapped. "There are consequences for defying us." I met her gaze without flinching. "I've lived with the consequences of pleasing you." That ended the conversation. Not officially, not ceremoniously, but something in the room broke. The unspoken agreement that I would absorb discomfort to keep things smooth. I left without another word. The drive home felt surreal, like moving through a city I'd lived in my whole life but was seeing clearly for the first time. The streets were the same, the sky was the same, but I was different. When I got home, there was a new message waiting for me. This one wasn't from family, it was from the oversight firm. "Preliminary determinations complete, formal notices pending." My hands shook slightly as I read it, not from fear, but from release. This wasn't abstract anymore. It was reaching a conclusion. Daniel came home later than usual. He didn't speak to me. He went straight to the bedroom and closed the door. For the first time, I didn't feel compelled to follow him. That night, as I lay alone, I thought about the confrontation again. about how carefully they'd arranged themselves, about how certain they'd been that authority would win over clarity. They hadn't considered one thing. Authority only works when everyone agrees to recognize it. I hadn't withdrawn, I hadn't backed down, and now the structure they'd built on expectation and intimidation was facing something it couldn't override: a record. The next phase would be public in ways they couldn't soften or spin. Notices, formal language, documented outcomes. There would be no more private conversations, no more closed rooms. As I drifted toward sleep, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the marriage that had never been what I thought it was. Relief that I no longer had to pretend otherwise. The confrontation had ended, but the reckoning had only just begun. And this time, there would be no one left to blame but themselves. The fallout arrived quietly, delivered not through confrontation but through paperwork. I was at my desk when the first formal notice came through, its subject line stripped of all emotion. Determination issued. I opened it slowly, reading each line with care. Temporary measures were now confirmed. Certain authorities revoked. Certain actions deemed improper under existing agreements. Language precise enough to be irrefutable. This was no longer a pause, it was a ruling. Within minutes my phone began to ring. I didn't answer. I read the notice again, then a third time, absorbing the weight of what had finally been acknowledged. The plan they'd protected, the one built on quiet consent and assumed obedience, had been formally dismantled. Another message arrived, this one confirming that notifications had been sent to all relevant parties. Relevant parties meant Daniel, his mother, his sister. Anyone who had benefited from the arrangement they insisted didn't involve me. I stood and walked to the window, watching the afternoon light stretch across the street. Somewhere across town they were opening their own messages, realizing that the story they'd rehearsed no longer mattered. Daniel came home early again. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice. He stood in the entryway, notice in hand, his face pale in a way I'd never seen before. "They finalized it," he said. I nodded. "I know." His eyes flicked to me, searching for something. Satisfaction, guilt, mercy. "This affects everything," he said. "Accounts, access, plans." "Yes," I replied simply. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. "My mother says this will follow us, that it's on record now." On record, the phrase landed heavily. "I tried to stop it," he added, almost pleading. "I told them to slow down." I looked at him then, really looked, and saw the truth beneath his words. He hadn't tried to stop it for me. He'd tried to stop it for himself. "You didn't try to stop it," I said. "You tried to keep it from costing you." He flinched. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house felt cavernous, every sound amplified. A car passing outside, the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet end of something neither of us had the courage to name. "What do you want now?" he asked finally. The question surprised me, not because it was asked, but because for the first time it wasn't framed as a negotiation. "I want distance," I said, "and clarity." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer all along. By evening, the extended family had gone silent. No more calls, no more messages. The pressure had evaporated, replaced by something colder. Acceptance. They had lost leverage. The system they relied on had spoken in a language they couldn't override with authority or reputation. And now they were left to deal with the consequences privately, without me absorbing the damage. That night I packed a bag. Not in anger, not in haste, just methodically, clothes folded neatly, documents placed carefully into a folder. I left the ring on the dresser, its absence louder than any argument. Daniel watched from the doorway but didn't stop me. "I never thought you'd do this," he said quietly. "I never thought you'd give me a reason," I replied. I stayed with a friend that night, the spare room unfamiliar but peaceful. As I lay there in the dark, my phone buzzed one last time. It was a final confirmation. All actions concluded, case closed. I exhaled deeply, feeling something unclench inside me. This wasn't victory, it wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense, it was restoration. The next morning, headlines began to circulate quietly within the circles that mattered. Nothing sensational, just mentions, notes, whispers of procedural failures and internal reviews. The family name appeared alongside words they'd spent years avoiding. Irregularities, oversight, review. Daniel texted once more that afternoon. They're saying this will take years to clean up. I typed my response carefully. It shouldn't have been dirty in the first place. He didn't reply. As the day wore on, I felt the weight of what had ended settle fully. Not just a marriage, but a version of myself that had been shaped by permission and restraint. They had believed I was powerless because I was quiet. They had mistaken my patience for compliance. Now everything they thought was untouchable had been formally, irrevocably altered. And as I stood in a borrowed kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise on a life that was finally my own, I understood something with perfect clarity. This wasn't the end. It was the moment the balance shifted. From their hands to mine. The days that followed were quieter than I expected, and that was what unsettled me most. There were no more calls from Eleanor, no frantic messages from Daniel's sister. The family that once moved in unison, loud and confident in its certainty, had retreated into silence. It wasn't peace, it was damage control. I spent that week tying up things I'd neglected for years. Updating accounts in my own name, redirecting mail, notifying people who mattered, and ignoring those who didn't. Each small task felt like reclaiming a square inch of ground I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. Daniel and I spoke only once more, and even that conversation felt obligatory rather than emotional. We met in a neutral space, a quiet cafe neither of us had any history with. He looked tired, older. The confidence he once carried so easily had dulled. "They're blaming me," he said after a long pause. "My mother, my sister, they say I should have handled you better." I wrapped my hands around my coffee and waited. "They're saying I misjudged you," he continued, almost bitterly, "that I underestimated you." The words stung, but not the way they once would have. "You didn't underestimate me," I said. "You ignored me." He looked down at the table, tracing a crack in the wood with his finger. "I didn't think you'd ever push back." "I know," I replied. That was the closest we came to honesty. When we parted, there were no promises, no dramatic closure. Just the quiet understanding that whatever had once existed between us was no longer salvageable. That evening, I received a message from Laura, the accountant. It was short, professional, and carefully worded. "I wanted you to know," she wrote, "that certain internal reviews are expanding. I can't say more, but I thought you deserved awareness." Awareness, not reassurance, not comfort, just truth. I thanked her and closed my laptop, feeling the last thread of obligation slip away. Whatever happened next was no longer my responsibility to manage or soften. A few days later, I ran into someone who used to orbit the family, an acquaintance I'd seen at dinners and events, someone who had always smiled politely but kept their distance. She hesitated when she saw me, then approached. "I just wanted to say," she said quietly, "I admired what you did." I was taken aback. "I didn't do anything remarkable." She shook her head. "You did what no one else ever did. You refused to disappear." Her words stayed with me long after we parted. For the first time, I allowed myself to look back without flinching. At the dinners where I'd been talked over, the decisions made without my input, the subtle corrections when I spoke too directly, laughed too loudly, asked the wrong questions. None of it had been accidental. It had been systematic. And I had survived it. One afternoon, I opened a box I'd packed years ago and never unpacked, filled with old notes and documents I'd saved just in case. I smiled at the irony. Even then, some part of me had known. I didn't feel anger as I sorted through it, just clarity. The world hadn't ended when I stopped being agreeable. It hadn't collapsed when I stopped absorbing discomfort for others. If anything, it had widened. The final confirmation came in the form of a brief notice forwarded to me by someone who still cared enough to keep me informed. The family's internal restructuring was underway. Advisors replaced, access limited, long-standing arrangements dissolved. They were paying for years of quiet decisions all at once. That night, as I sat alone in my new apartment, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and unfamiliar quiet, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the loud kind, not the vindictive kind, the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had honored myself, even when it cost me everything familiar. I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of all this. The one who believed survival meant silence. The one who thought strength was measured by how much she could endure without complaint. I wished I could tell her what I knew now. That dignity isn't preserved by shrinking. That peace doesn't come from compliance. That power doesn't announce itself, it waits. And when it finally moves, it does so without apology. The reckoning was complete, not just for them, but for me. All that remained was the life ahead of me, unburdened by expectations that were never mine to fulfill. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. The morning everything finally settled, I woke up without checking my phone. That alone told me how far I'd come. For months, my first instinct had been vigilance, alerts, messages, numbers that could change my life with a single vibration. That morning, there was only sunlight slipping through the curtains of my apartment, and the low hum of the city starting another ordinary day, no emergencies, no fires to put out. I made coffee slowly, deliberately, savoring the quiet. Outside, someone laughed. A car door slammed. Life moved on, indifferent to the collapse that had once felt so total and consuming. By then, the fallout was no longer theoretical. The legal hold I had triggered had done exactly what it was designed to do. Investigations had expanded. Financial pathways had been frozen. Plans that relied on secrecy and speed had died under fluorescent lights and official stamps. Daniel's family stopped pretending it was a misunderstanding. They stopped calling it private. They stopped calling me anything at all. I heard updates through distance and silence, through people who spoke carefully, through documents that didn't use emotion at all. The passports never materialized. The money never moved. The narrative they'd built cracked under scrutiny, not because I argued, but because the law did. And that distinction mattered. I didn't win by shouting louder. I didn't win by exposing secrets for drama or revenge. I won by stepping aside and letting the truth function the way it was meant to. That was the part no one expected. Daniel reached out one final time, weeks later, with a message that read like closure, but felt more like surrender. He didn't apologize the way people do when they understand. He apologized the way people do when they're out of options. "I didn't think it would go this far," he wrote. "Neither did I once." That was the danger of underestimating quiet people. We don't announce the moment we stop accepting what's handed to us. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in contracts, filings, and consequences. Instead, I focused on rebuilding something that had been neglected for too long, my own sense of authorship. I reconnected with friends I drifted from while trying to keep peace at someone else's table. I reclaimed routines that had been interrupted by constant accommodation. I made plans that didn't require approval. The most surprising change wasn't freedom, it was clarity. I saw, in hindsight, how often I'd been framed as difficult the moment I asked questions. How quickly concern became inconvenience. How easily loyalty was demanded but never returned. None of that had been about love or family. It had been about control. And control doesn't survive daylight. One evening, while organizing old files I no longer needed to keep, I found the agreement again, the clause that had started everything. It was unremarkable on the page, a few lines, neutral language, no drama. But it represented something larger than the collapse it caused. It represented the moment I chose myself without asking permission. I didn't keep the document. I didn't need to. Its work was done. What stayed with me was the lesson. Silence is only weakness when it's fear. When it's intentional, when it's informed, it becomes leverage. I wasn't proud of the damage that followed, but I wasn't ashamed of it either. Consequences aren't cruelty. They're boundaries enforced too late. If there's one thing I know now, it's this. Families don't fall apart because one person speaks up. They fall apart because too many people decide it's easier not to. I didn't destroy anything. I stopped holding it together for people who never held me. As my life moved forward, lighter and unmistakably my own, I understood that the story wasn't really about betrayal or revenge. It was about recognition. About realizing that staying silent to survive isn't the same as living. And if you've ever been told to stay quiet for the sake of peace, if you've ever been excluded from decisions that defined your own future, if you've ever felt like the only way to belong was to disappear, I see you. You're not invisible, you're not powerless, and you're not wrong for wanting more. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share where you're watching from, or tell me about a moment you chose yourself when it mattered most. Your voice might be the one someone else needs to hear. And if you want more stories about quiet strength, hidden power, and the moment everything turns, stay with me. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and don't go anywhere. The next story is already waiting. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.